In the spring of 2019, a GPS-collared grizzly bear, designated by researchers as Bear 863, left her denning site in the Absaroka Range, east of Yellowstone National Park, and descended toward the valley floor 2 weeks earlier than her movement history predicted. She had emerged from previous winters between April 12th and April 19th, across 4 years of tracking data. In 2019, she emerged on March 28th. That deviation was noted in the field logs and filed as an anomaly. What was more significant, and what was not immediately apparent from that single data point, was what she did next. Rather than moving toward the riparian corridors along the Yellowstone River, where she had spent the first weeks of post-denning recovery in each of the 3 previous springs, foraging on sedges and the winter-killed elk carcasses that pile up along the river bottoms, she moved northeast. She climbed. She crossed 2 drainages that were still locked in late winter snowpack and descended into a high sagebrush basin where a pronghorn herd had established an early migration route that ran, according to the tracking data collected over the following weeks, directly through her new home range position. In the first 18 days after emergence, she killed 4 pronghorn. In the previous 3 springs combined, her GPS data and the correlated field observations did not document a single pronghorn predation event in the first month of activity. In 2019, she opened her season with a hunting pattern that her own behavioral history could not have predicted from the baseline. Researchers at the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, the collaborative monitoring program that has been tracking the Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly population since 1973, flagged Bear 863's behavior as part of a broader pattern they had been assembling from collar data, hair snare genetic sampling, mortality records, and field observations across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem over the preceding 5 years. What they were seeing, aggregated across dozens of collared individuals and extrapolated through indirect indicators for the uncollared population, was not a single bear making an unusual choice. It was a population shifting. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested the grizzlies of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem had become fundamentally different animals overnight, but shifting with a consistency across multiple behavioral dimensions: timing of emergence, elevation of foraging, prey selection, movement corridor use, seasonal diet composition, that pointed to something systemic rather than random. If you want to understand large carnivore ecology at the level where the data actually lives, and if you want to understand why what is happening to the grizzlies near Yellowstone matters in ways that extend well beyond the borders of a national park, stay with this, because the story the data is telling is more complex, more consequential, and in some ways more unsettling than either the triumphalist narrative of grizzly recovery or the simplified threat narrative that dominates most public discussion of this species. And if what you see here is worth your time, subscribe before you leave, because this is the kind of thing we will keep doing. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is not Yellowstone National Park. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what the behavioral data means and why the patterns being documented represent something more than a natural population doing what natural populations do. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is a landmass of approximately 22 million acres, encompassing the national park at its core, surrounded by national forests, Bureau of Land Management land, state lands, tribal lands, and private ranches and agricultural operations. The grizzly bear population that uses this landscape does not respect the administrative boundaries that divide it into jurisdictions, with different management mandates and different tolerance thresholds for large predators. The bears move across all of it, and the shifts in their movement and foraging behavior that the data from the last 5 years documents are not happening uniformly within the protected core. They are happening most prominently at the edges, in the transition zones where the park meets the national forests, where the forests meet the private land, where the bears are pushing against the boundaries of the space that human communities have implicitly or explicitly assigned to them. That is where the behavioral changes are most pronounced, where the documentation is most detailed, and where the implications for human communities are most immediate. To understand why those behavioral changes are happening, you need to understand what the grizzly bears of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been eating, how their diet has changed over the past several decades, and why the dietary foundation on which the population rebuilt itself during the recovery period has become unstable in ways that have accelerating consequences for where bears go, when they go there, and what they are willing to do to satisfy caloric needs that do not diminish simply because their preferred food sources have declined. The grizzly bear is a dietary generalist in the technical sense that it is capable of processing and deriving nutrition from an extraordinarily wide range of food sources. But within that generalism, populations develop specific dietary strategies that are shaped by the available resources of their specific ecosystems, and that can become, over time, dependencies rather than preferences. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the grizzly population developed a suite of high-calorie, seasonally concentrated food sources that structured the annual cycle of foraging behavior across generations of bears. 3 of them are central to understanding the current moment. The first is the whitebark pine. Whitebark pine nuts represent one of the highest calorie food sources available to grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. A single whitebark pine seed contains approximately 5 calories, and the caches created by Clark's nutcrackers, the bird species that harvests and buries whitebark seeds, can contain thousands of seeds per cache. Bears locate these caches with a facility that reflects the extraordinary olfactory capability of the species and the learned foraging strategies passed from mothers to cubs across generations. In good cone years, grizzly bears in the upper elevation zones of the ecosystem consumed whitebark pine nuts with an intensity that fundamentally shaped their hyperphagia behavior, the pre-denning feeding frenzy during which bears must accumulate sufficient fat reserves to survive a winter fast of up to 7 months. A bear with access to abundant whitebark pine nuts could dramatically accelerate the pace of fat deposition in late summer and early fall, spending less time foraging across a broader landscape and achieving the body condition necessary for winter survival more efficiently. The caloric density of the resource effectively compressed the geographic footprint required for successful hyperphagia. The whitebark pine has been functionally devastated in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem over the past 2 decades. The cause is a combination of forces that compound each other in a way that makes the decline difficult to reverse within any time frame relevant to current bear populations. White pine blister rust, an introduced pathogen, has killed or severely damaged a substantial proportion of mature whitebark pines across the ecosystem. Mountain pine beetle, whose range expansion into high-elevation forests has been facilitated by warming winters that historically would have suppressed beetle populations through cold temperature die-offs, has further reduced the viable whitebark pine canopy. A United States Forest Service assessment, published in 2019, estimated that between 50 and 75% of whitebark pines in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem showed evidence of blister rust infection, beetle infestation, or mortality attributable to one or both. The productive cone-bearing capacity of the whitebark pine component of the ecosystem has been dramatically reduced from what it was when the current grizzly population's foraging strategies were established. In years of poor whitebark pine cone production, which are now more common than good years and may become the norm as the remaining mature trees continue to decline, bears that were historically supported by this high-calorie resource must replace those calories somewhere else. The behavioral consequences of that replacement are the subject of a significant proportion of the research activity that has been accelerating in the ecosystem over the last decade. The second anchor food source is the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Lake Yellowstone, Yellowstone Lake, contains the largest inland cutthroat trout population in North America. The tributary streams that flow into the lake from the surrounding high country have historically provided grizzly bears, along with black bears, osprey, river otters, and other predators and scavengers, with concentrated access to spawning cutthroat trout during the late spring and early summer spawning runs. This is not a food source on the scale of the whitebark pine in caloric terms, but it is concentrated, predictable, and requires relatively low energy expenditure to exploit. Bears positioned near spawning streams during the peak run could take large numbers of fish with minimal movement cost. The caloric contribution of cutthroat trout to the late spring and early summer diet of greater Yellowstone grizzlies was real and documented through stable isotope analysis of bear hair samples, which preserves a chemical record of what an individual has been eating during the period of hair growth. Lake trout, a non-native species, introduced illegally into Yellowstone Lake at some point before their presence was documented in 1994, have accomplished a collapse of the cutthroat trout spawning run that is one of the most ecologically damaging invasive species events in the documented history of protected areas in the American West. Lake trout prey on juvenile cutthroat trout with a predatory efficiency that has reduced the cutthroat population in Yellowstone Lake by an estimated 90% from its pre-invasion baseline. The cutthroat trout that once ran up the tributary streams, in numbers sufficient to represent a meaningful caloric subsidy for the grizzly population, now run in numbers that represent a fraction of that historical availability. The lake trout that replaced them do not spawn in the shallows and tributary streams that bears can access. They spawn in deep water that bears cannot reach. The caloric resource that the cutthroat runs represented for the greater Yellowstone grizzly population has been effectively removed from the spring diet by the lake trout invasion. National Park Service fisheries managers have been conducting lake trout suppression operations in Yellowstone Lake since the early 2000s, with annual removals that have grown to over 300,000 fish per year. The cutthroat population has shown some recovery in response to these efforts, but has not returned to pre-invasion abundance levels, and the trajectory of recovery remains uncertain. The third food source is army cutworm moths. This one is less familiar to most people who think about grizzly bears because it involves a behavior that looks strange from the outside, and because it occurs at elevations and in terrain that most people never see. Army cutworm moths, which are agricultural pests in their larval stage in the plains east of the Rockies, migrate to high-elevation talus slopes in the Rocky Mountain Range to estivate, or spend the summer dormant, in the cool air spaces between rocks. They aggregate in these talus fields in densities that can reach tens of thousands of moths per square meter of rock surface. Grizzly bears have learned to locate these aggregations and to spend long periods on the talus slopes in late summer, turning rocks and consuming moths with a focused attention that reflects the caloric value of the resource. A single moth contains approximately half a calorie of fat and protein. A bear consuming moths for 12 hours a day in a productive talus field can ingest tens of thousands of individual moths. The caloric contribution to hyperphagia from a good moth year in accessible high-elevation habitat can be substantial. This food source is less subject to the specific decline pressures affecting whitebark pine and cutthroat trout, but it is sensitive to agricultural pesticide use on the plains where the moth populations originate, and there is documented year-to-year variability in moth aggregation density that makes it an unreliable primary substitute for the declining anchor foods. Viewed together, the three food sources that anchored the greater Yellowstone grizzlies' seasonal dietary strategy have all experienced significant decline over the past 2 decades, with the whitebark pine decline being the most severe and the most structurally permanent. a population of bears that has grown during a period of relative food abundance, expanding its numbers under the protection of the Endangered Species Act from fewer than 200 individuals in the 1970s to an estimated 700 to 1,000 individuals in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem today, is now larger than it was when its primary high-calorie food sources were more abundant. The caloric mathematics of that situation are not complicated, but their behavioral expression is varied, and in some dimensions, alarming. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team's data from the last 5 years captures this behavioral expression across multiple dimensions simultaneously. And the convergence of the signals across different data streams is what makes the pattern compelling, and what makes the last 5 years distinct from earlier periods of food stress documentation. The signals are coming from GPS collar data, which provides high-resolution spatial and temporal movement records for instrumented individuals. They are coming from mortality records, which show where bears are dying, how, and at what ages. They are coming from depredation incident reports, which document livestock kills by grizzlies across the public and private lands surrounding the ecosystem. They are coming from conflict incident reports, which document close encounters between bears and people and the distribution of those encounters across the landscape. And they are coming from dietary analysis, specifically stable isotope work and the field recovery of bear scats and hair samples, which allows researchers to reconstruct what individual bears have been eating during specific periods and compare those dietary profiles against historical baselines. What the GPS collar data shows most clearly is a change in the spatial extent and timing of bear movements that is pronounced at the population level, and most pronounced in certain demographic subgroups. Adult males, which are the largest bears in the population and have the highest caloric requirements, are moving farther from the park core in the fall hyperphagia period than their GPS histories from 5 or more years ago would predict. The average fall home range size for collared adult males in the data compiled by the study team for the 2019 to 2023 period is measurably larger than the average home range size for the same demographic class documented in the 2010 to 2015 period. This expansion of fall home ranges is not uniform across all individuals or across all years. It is patterned. It correlates with whitebark pine cone production indices, with the result that the years of lowest cone production show the most dramatic home range expansion. In bad whitebark pine years, bears that cannot satisfy their hyperphagia caloric requirements at high elevation are descending to lower elevations and moving into the surrounding forests and private land matrix, where alternative food sources exist. Those alternative food sources include natural foods, like berries, roots, and ungulates. They also include anthropogenic foods and livestock. The livestock depredation data is the dimension of the behavioral shift that has generated the most immediate management attention and the most friction between wildlife managers and the ranching communities that operate in the lands surrounding the ecosystem. Cattle and sheep grazing allotments in the national forests adjacent to Yellowstone have been part of the land use pattern of the region for over a century. Grizzly bears killing livestock on these allotments is not new. What the incident data shows for the 2019 to 2023 period is an increase in the number of livestock depredation incidents, an increase in the number of individual bears implicated in repeated depredation events, and a geographic expansion of depredation events into allotments and private land parcels that did not historically experience chronic grizzly bear livestock conflicts. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department, the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Agency, and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game all documented elevated livestock depredation rates in the 2020, 2021, and 2022 seasons that exceeded the 5-year rolling averages from the preceding period. The United States Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Services Program, which administers compensation payments to ranchers for confirmed grizzly bear livestock kills, processed higher total claim values in 2021 and 2022 than in any previous two-year period in the compensation program's history in the Greater Yellowstone region. The depredation incidents are not random. They cluster geographically in the transition zones between protected and unprotected land on the south and east sides of the ecosystem, which correspond to the areas where grizzly population growth has been pushing bears into habitat that was at or beyond the range margin a decade ago. They cluster temporally in the late summer and fall period that coincides with the peak caloric demand of hyperphagia, and they cluster demographically in two bear types that appear consistently in the incident literature as the animals most likely to be involved in repeated livestock kills. The first is subadult males, bears in the 2 to 5 year age range that have been weaned from their mothers but have not yet established territories or developed the full suite of foraging behaviors that adult males use to meet their caloric needs. These animals are nutritionally vulnerable in the best food years and critically stressed in bad whitebark pine years. They are also the dispersing animals, the ones pushing into new areas, testing the edges of the human-dominated landscape with the tentativeness of youth and the desperation of animals that are not yet competent enough to compete effectively for the better natural food sources that more experienced bears monopolize. The second type is adult females with cubs, specifically females with yearling or second-year cubs whose energy requirements are elevated by nursing and whose movement patterns are already conservative in ways that limit their ability to reach the high-elevation natural food sources that more mobile adult males can access. The behavioral dynamic that produces repeated livestock killers from these two demographic pools is instructive and directly parallels the habituation process documented in other large carnivore species. A subadult male bear, unable to compete with larger animals at natural food concentrations and facing a landscape where the predictable high-calorie resources of the whitebark pine zone are declining, descends to lower elevation in late summer and encounters a livestock grazing allotment. The first kill, when it occurs, is usually opportunistic, rather than predatory in the strategic sense. A sick or injured animal, a calf separated from its mother, a sheep that has become isolated from the herd. The bear kills it, consumes a quantity of high-protein, high-fat meat that is exceptional relative to what it has been able to obtain from natural sources in the same period, and leaves. The caloric payoff of that kill is recorded, in whatever way bears record successful outcomes, as a relationship between that type of location, that type of smell, and a positive caloric result. The bear returns. Not every bear that kills livestock once becomes a chronic depredator, but the data shows a clear tendency for bears that have made successful livestock kills to return to the same allotments and the same private land parcels, sometimes within days, sometimes after a gap of weeks. The bears that become chronic depredators, that account for a disproportionate fraction of the total confirmed kills each year, are invariably animals that made their first kill in a period of documented nutritional stress, and that have, through repetition, developed what researchers describe as a search image and a site fidelity for livestock that persists even in years when natural food availability partially recovers. The management response to chronic livestock depredators involves a tiered escalation that runs from non-lethal deterrence through translocation to lethal removal. Non-lethal deterrence includes range riders, electric fencing around carcass attractants, guard animals, and range management practices that reduce the vulnerability of livestock to grizzly bear predation. Translocation moves a problem bear to a different part of the ecosystem. Lethal removal kills the animal. The management data from the last 5 years shows an increase in the proportion of documented conflicts that escalate to the lethal removal stage, and it shows something more significant in the translocation outcomes. Bears translocated from a depredation conflict area in the southern or eastern reaches of the ecosystem have shown a documented tendency to return to the conflict area, sometimes crossing more than 100 miles of intervening terrain. This homing behavior is not new to grizzly bear management, but the rate at which translocated bears are returning to conflict sites, rather than establishing new home ranges in the release area, appears to have increased. The study team's translocation outcome tracking, which follows GPS-collared animals after release, shows that the proportion of translocated bears that successfully established long-term residency in the release area and did not return to the conflict zone declined between the 2015 to 2018 period and the 2019 to 2023 period. The bears are more motivated. The caloric case for returning to the site where they have successfully found food is stronger in a landscape where natural food abundance is less reliable than it once was. The hunting behavior changes documented in the last 5 years extend beyond the livestock depredation context in ways that are ecologically significant and that represent genuine departures from what the behavioral record from the recovery period would have predicted. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have historically been classified as predators that take ungulate prey, primarily through scavenging and opportunistic kills of vulnerable individuals, newborn calves, winter-weakened adults, animals injured by other causes. Active predation of healthy adult elk or bison, while documented, was not considered a primary hunting strategy for the population, in the way that it is for the wolves that were reintroduced to the ecosystem in 1995. The data from the last 5 years has complicated this characterization in ways that matter for how we understand the ecosystem and for how we understand what the bears are doing. Field documentation and GPS tracking of bears in the northern Yellowstone Range, the area north and east of the park that encompasses some of the most productive ungulate habitat in the ecosystem, and that was the primary focus of wolf reintroduction effects research, shows an increase in the frequency of active elk calf predation by grizzly bears during the late May and early June calving season. This is not unprecedented. Grizzly bears have been observed and documented killing elk calves during the calving period for as long as researchers have been in the field in Yellowstone. What the more recent data suggests is that some individual bears, particularly adult males and subadult males, have developed more persistent and targeted calving ground hunting strategies that reflect a greater allocation of time and energy to elk calf searching behavior than their predecessors documented in earlier research periods devoted. The correlation with poor whitebark pine cone production the previous fall is present in the data, consistent with the hypothesis that bears that enter spring in suboptimal body condition from a nutritionally difficult previous hyperphagia season are allocating more effort to high-protein prey during the spring period, when elk calves represent the most accessible large prey item in the landscape. The interaction between grizzly bears and wolves on the northern Yellowstone Range complicates the interpretation of the elk predation data in ways that are genuinely interesting. Wolves in Yellowstone kill elk throughout the year, and wolf kills in the winter and spring provide an abundant carrion resource that grizzly bears have been documented exploiting at high rates since wolves were re-established. The kleptoparasitism, or food theft, that grizzly bears practice on wolf-killed carcasses is one of the most extensively documented interspecific competitive dynamics in the ecosystem, and it represents a behavioral flexibility in the grizzlies that has important caloric consequences. Grizzly bears have learned the auditory and olfactory cues associated with wolf hunting activity. Individual bears that have learned to locate wolf kill sites rapidly can obtain substantial caloric returns for relatively low energy investment, particularly in winter when the bears themselves have limited hunting efficiency due to snow conditions. The documented pattern of grizzly bear use of wolf kill sites in the northern range represents a behavioral adaptation that emerged, in its current intensified form, with the wolf population's growth after reintroduction, and that has become a reliable component of the annual diet of some individual bears. What the data from 2019 to 2023 adds to this picture is an indication that the competitive dynamics at wolf kills are changing as both the wolf and grizzly populations fluctuate. Wolf population numbers in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been variable since the mid-2000s, affected by disease, hunting pressure in the states adjacent to the park where hunting of wolves outside park boundaries is permitted, and territorial dynamics. Periods of lower wolf abundance reduce the density of wolf kill sites available as a carrion resource for bears. In those periods, bears that have been relying on wolf kill kleptoparasitism as a component of their caloric budget face a resource gap that must be filled from other sources. The multi-year data shows that some individual bears, tracked through periods of both high and low wolf kill availability, have responded to reduced wolf kill access by increasing the frequency of their independent predation attempts, consistent with the hypothesis that kleptoparasitism and independent hunting are partly substitutable in the behavioral repertoire of individual grizzlies, and that bears are not passive in adjusting the balance between them when resource availability shifts. The elevation dimension of the behavioral changes, documented in the last 5 years, is one of the more striking and less publicly discussed components of the pattern. Grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem have historically shown a strong seasonal use of high-elevation habitat during the late summer period, when whitebark pine cones are maturing and moths are aggregating on the talus slopes. This high-elevation use pattern was so consistent in the GPS data from the pre-2015 period that researchers used it as a proxy indicator for the availability of these foods in a given year. Good whitebark pine years produced dense bear clustering at high elevation in August and September. Bad years produced more dispersed, lower elevation movements. The data from 2019 to 2023 shows a continued pattern of reduced high-elevation use in poor whitebark pine years, which is not surprising and consistent with the established understanding. What is newer in the data is evidence that even in moderate or relatively good cone years, some individual bears, particularly adult males that have been previously involved in lower elevation foraging and conflict situations, are not returning to the high-elevation habitat with the same fidelity that their own behavioral history from before the current period would predict. The lower elevation behavioral pattern, once established, appears in some individuals to be partially self-reinforcing, with animals continuing to use conflict zone habitats and anthropogenic food sources in years when natural high-elevation foods might have drawn them back. This is the habituation dimension of the hunting pattern change, and it parallels the documented processes in other large carnivore systems in ways that wildlife researchers find significant. The grizzly that has spent multiple fall seasons navigating ranch land, encountering cattle, and finding caloric success in the lower elevation agricultural matrix is a different behavioral entity than the wilderness grizzly of the historical conception. Not a different species, not an animal that has abandoned its nature, but an animal whose learned behavioral strategies have shifted along a gradient that has consequences for its own management status, for the safety of the human communities it is moving through, and for the tolerance that those communities extend toward grizzly bears as a class. The rancher who has had 20 confirmed cattle kills in 3 seasons is not operating from an abstract understanding of grizzly bear ecology when she expresses opposition to continued federal protections for the species. She is operating from a direct material experience of what the behavioral shift in her portion of the landscape looks like in practice. That perspective is entitled to honest engagement, not dismissal. The human safety dimension of the behavioral changes is the one that commands the most public attention and the one that generates the most fraught management conversations. Grizzly bear attacks on humans in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem are not common. They are not becoming common, the statistical framework that places the individual risk of any specific encounter resulting in injury at a low probability is accurate and should not be abandoned in favor of a narrative that serves fear more than understanding. But the attack data from the last 5 years is not uniform with the preceding period, and the character of the attacks that have occurred, specifically the proportion of attacks classified by investigators as predatory rather than defensive, is one of the dimensions that researchers have flagged as requiring careful examination. Grizzly bear attacks are categorized by wildlife managers and researchers into 2 primary types. Defensive attacks occur when a bear perceives a threat to itself, its cubs, or a food source, and responds with aggressive contact. They are the most common type of grizzly bear attack documented historically in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and in grizzly range broadly. A hiker who surprises a mother grizzly at close range is at risk of a defensive attack. A hunter who inadvertently approaches a carcass that a grizzly has claimed is at risk of a defensive attack. These attacks often consist of a single knockdown or bite, and then withdrawal by the bear once the perceived threat retreats or is neutralized. Predatory attacks are fundamentally different in their behavioral structure. In a predatory attack, the bear approaches a human with intent, not in response to a perceived threat, but in pursuit of a prey item. Predatory attacks are typically silent and deliberate, do not follow a surprise encounter, and involve the bear continuing or returning to the victim rather than withdrawing once the initial contact has been made. They are far less common than defensive attacks in the historical record, but carry a higher fatality rate because the dynamics that terminate them are different, and because fighting back, which is sometimes counterproductive in defensive attack contexts, is essential in predatory ones. The incident analysis from the 2019 to 2023 period, compiled from official investigation reports by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team and the relevant state and federal agencies, shows that the proportion of attacks classified as predatory has increased relative to the preceding 5-year period. The absolute numbers are small. Grizzly bear attacks on humans in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem remain rare events, typically fewer than 10 per year in any given season, when all encounter types, including minor incidents, are counted, with serious injury or fatality incidents far rarer. But within that small number, the shift in the proportion classified as predatory is a signal that researchers are taking seriously, and the demographic characteristics of the bears involved in predatory attacks in the recent period are consistent with the broader behavioral pattern being documented across the GPS, dietary, and conflict data. The predatory attacks of the 2019 to 2023 period disproportionately involve younger bears in the subadult to young adult age range, bears with home ranges that include significant portions of private and national forest land beyond the park boundary, and bears for which subsequent investigation or prior documentation suggested nutritional stress or previous involvement in livestock depredation incidents. The connection between nutritional stress, range expansion, habituation to human-dominated landscapes, and elevated predatory behavior toward humans is not a theory. It is a pattern in the data. The hunters who work the national forests adjacent to Yellowstone in the fall elk and deer seasons represent a specific population that the attack data has increasingly highlighted. Hunter encounters with grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem increased substantially in the 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022 seasons relative to the preceding decade of averages, according to data compiled by the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team from mandatory incident reporting programs. The encounters cluster in the backcountry hunting units that abut the park boundary, where grizzly bears moving off the park are concentrated by their own movement patterns, and where hunters with elk carcasses represent a combination of large protein sources and potential competitive threat that produces the highest risk encounter scenario for a grizzly bear. A hunter who has just killed an elk and is field dressing the animal, is in a position of extraordinary vulnerability from a grizzly encounter standpoint. The carcass smell draws bears from significant distances. The hunter's attention is focused on the processing task. The sound environment is compromised by the work, and the bear that approaches a field-dressed elk carcass is in a motivational state, focused on a high-value food source that makes it less likely to withdraw from an encounter and more likely to behave aggressively. Several of the most serious grizzly attacks on hunters in the 2019 to 2023 period shared exactly this scenario structure, and the bears involved were subsequently tracked or identified in ways that connected them to a pattern of carcass exploitation in the area that predated the specific incident. The bear spray data from this period deserves specific examination because it represents one of the few areas where the behavioral response of the human population to an elevated encounter environment has demonstrably kept pace with the changing risk landscape, and because the outcomes associated with bear spray use continue to support the robust consensus that it is the single most effective individual deterrent available in the event of a close encounter. Multiple peer-reviewed analyses of grizzly bear attack outcomes in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, including a comprehensive study published in the Journal of Wildlife Management that examined incidents from 2010 to 2020, have found that bear spray deployment in the close encounter context was associated with significantly better outcomes for both humans and bears than firearms use in the same scenario types. The reasons are biological and situational. Bear spray, deployed at close range from a moving approaching bear, causes immediate mucous membrane irritation that disrupts the bear's sensory systems and interrupts the attack sequence with a consistency that the varied marksmanship capabilities of backcountry users and the shot placement requirements for stopping a charging grizzly do not replicate. The data supports the guidance. Carry spray. Deploy it. The guidance has not been invalidated by the behavioral changes in the bear population, and in a period when encounter rates are elevated, the case for consistent carry and practice deployment is stronger than it has ever been. The elk population dynamics of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem intersect with the grizzly behavioral story in ways that are not straightforward and that reflect the genuinely complex, multi-species character of the ecosystem interactions being documented. Elk numbers in the northern Yellowstone herd, the most intensively studied and historically most abundant elk population in the ecosystem, declined substantially after wolf reintroduction in 1995 and have remained well below pre-wolf population levels for the past 2 decades. The precise causes of that decline and the relative contributions of wolf predation, bear predation, hunter harvest, drought effects on forage quality, and density-dependent factors remain contested among researchers with different analytical frameworks and different data emphases. What is not contested is that the northern herd is smaller than it was before wolves were returned, and smaller than it was at the peak of the post-wolf decline period. A smaller elk population in the northern range produces fewer winter-killed carcasses, fewer calving season calf opportunities, and a more competitive environment for the large predators that depend on elk as a component of their diet. Grizzly bears, wolves, cougars, and black bears are all competing for a prey resource that contracted significantly and has not returned to historical abundance. The competitive intensity for this resource shapes the behavior of all these predators in ways that are not fully disentangled in the current literature, but that the GPS data, the dietary isotope data, and the kill site documentation data are beginning to illuminate in their aggregate. The bison population tells a different story and represents one of the genuinely complex dimensions of what the bears are doing. Yellowstone's bison herd has grown to approximately 5,000 to 6,000 animals, making it one of the largest free-roaming bison herds in North America. Bison are too large to be killed by grizzly bears under most circumstances, but they die at rates that provide a substantial carrion resource. And bison carcasses in the spring, when winter-killed animals are exposed by snowmelt, represent significant caloric opportunities for bears emerging from dens in suboptimal body condition. Some large adult male grizzlies have been documented in predatory attacks on bison calves during the spring calving period, and the success rate of those attacks, while lower than comparable attacks on elk calves due to the defensive group behavior of bison herds, is sufficient to make them a documented component of the behavioral repertoire of some individuals. The growth of the bison herd as a carrion and calf predation resource partially offsets the decline of other food sources for the bears that are positioned to exploit it. The bears that are positioned to exploit it most effectively are those in the park interior and in the northern range, which limits the distributional relevance of this food source for the bears that are pushing into the peripheral zones where the conflict situation is most acute. The road ecology dimension of what is happening in the ecosystem is one of the least discussed but most structurally significant factors shaping the spatial distribution of the behavioral changes being documented. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem is bounded and internally divided by roads and highways that affect bear movement in ways that have been studied intensively with GPS collar data. The primary roads carrying high volumes of tourist and commercial traffic through and around the ecosystem create spatial barriers that some individual bears navigate successfully and others do not, with significant demographic consequences for the animals whose home ranges intersect with high traffic corridors. Bears killed by vehicle strikes, a mortality category that appears in the study team's annual reports with a consistency that reflects the structural reality of bears moving in terrain crossed by roads, are disproportionately the younger dispersing animals, the subadult males whose larger ranging behavior makes them most likely to cross major roads. Vehicle mortality of dispersing young males in the peripheral zones of the ecosystem imposes a cost on the population's demographic structure that is not catastrophic at current population size, but that has directional effects on the age structure and spatial distribution of the living population that interact with the behavioral patterns being documented in the conflict data. The climate dimension of the hunting pattern changes cannot be addressed honestly without acknowledging that the empirical relationships between climate variables and the food sources at the center of this story are complex, that the attribution of specific observed changes to climate drivers, specifically, as opposed to other interacting factors requires more statistical care than public discussion of the topic usually applies, and that nevertheless, the directional signals in the available data are consistent with the predictions that grizzly bear ecologists working from first principles would derive from the climate projections for the greater Yellowstone region. Warmer winters mean warmer high elevations, which means expanded pine beetle habitat, which means more whitebark pine mortality. Drought years reduce berry crops and reduce the condition of ungulate populations in ways that cascade through the predator community. Altered precipitation timing changes the phenological synchrony between bear emergence and the availability of spring green vegetation that historically provided an important transitional food source between den emergence and the arrival of summer's more calorie-dense resources. The behavioral changes being documented in the last 5 years are not occurring in a climatically stable environment. They are occurring in an environment that is moving directionally in ways that will continue to stress the food base on which the grizzly population in this ecosystem has been rebuilt. The policy context within which all of this is happening has itself been changing in ways that complicate the management response. The Yellowstone grizzly bear population was listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1975, when the population had declined to fewer than 200 individuals, and the trajectory of the decline suggested the possibility of local extinction. The recovery program that followed, which included habitat protection, hunting elimination, research investment, and the interagency coordination structure that produced the study team is one of the genuine success stories of American wildlife conservation. The population grew. The minimum viable population threshold that was established as the recovery criterion was exceeded. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service twice attempted to delist the Yellowstone population from Endangered Species Act protections, once in 2007 and once in 2017. Both delisting decisions were challenged in court and reversed by federal judges who found flaws in the regulatory reasoning supporting them, specifically related to inadequate consideration of the whitebark pine decline as a threat to the population's long-term food security. The delisting history is relevant to the behavioral data story because it reflects a fundamental tension in how the population's status is being assessed. The numeric recovery criteria, which focus on population size and distribution, indicate a recovered or nearly recovered population. The ecological and behavioral data, which points to a population navigating significant food security challenges with behavioral adaptations that are generating elevated conflict rates, suggests a population under stress in ways that population size alone does not capture. These are not necessarily contradictory assessments, but they point to different conclusions about the appropriate management response and about how much behavioral flexibility the management framework should accommodate before concluding that the population's relationship to its ecosystem has changed in ways that require policy adjustment rather than continued application of a recovery framework designed for a different situation. The tribal dimension of this management context is one that the standard wildlife management and media coverage of grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem consistently underweights or omits. The lands that comprise the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the surrounding region include the ceded territories and traditional lands of multiple sovereign tribal nations, including the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho of the Wind River Reservation, the Crow Nation, the Blackfeet Nation, and others whose relationships to the grizzly bear predate the American state by thousands of years, and whose perspectives on the management of the species are not reducible to the categories of either sport hunting advocacy or conventional wildlife conservation. The grizzly bear carries profound cultural and spiritual significance,